So our next panel is going to be a great discussion where we can get into a bit more just about reporting and particularly investigative reporting or asking the hard questions, getting answers out of people and entities that don't want to give them to you. To that end, I want to welcome, first we have Marcy Gordon. Marcy is newly, just last week, retired from the AP. So congratulations to her. She covered so much there, dating back to Enron. She was on the Pulitzer-winning team that covered Bush v. Gore. But most recently, she's been covering tech policy and has focused a lot on the FTC. So she will be talking about the FTC with us today. Next, we have Nihal Krishan. He is a tech reporter with FedScoop. He also covered tech for the Washington Examiner and before that for Mother Jones. So quite the variety of publications, very diverse. And then we have Ryan Blaney. Ryan is a lawyer with Proskauer. He's their head of privacy and cybersecurity in healthcare. And he has dealt with that alphabet soup that we've been talking about this week of GDPR, HIPAA, FERPA, COPPA, all of those. And so he can tell us what he thinks about, which is different than what we all think about when kind of getting into these things. So let's give them a hand.
So, as we all know in newsrooms, the first and foremost thing that I like to think about when I'm trying to approach powerful and opaque companies is, who is my audience most interested in? Is it their civic integrity team, their elections team, antitrust? Which part of a company are you most interested, or is your audience most interested in getting sensitive or unique information about, and then go about trying to find sources. I think one of the most proven effective methods of getting behind the door and getting important confidential information is reaching out to former and current employees at a company. So I think one of the best examples, at least in the tech world, which is where I come from, is Jeff Horowitz and the Facebook files of Wall Street Journal. And I remember tracking a bunch of his interviews after those stories came out, and DMing him. And what I learned is that it's a numbers game. He reached out to hundreds of Facebook employees and former Facebook employees on LinkedIn. I think these days beyond LinkedIn, like I use ZoomInfo, for example, or LexisNexis. You can even get cell phone numbers and emails that way. And you're trying to find a needle in the haystack here. He reached out to Frances Haugen Jeff in the middle of 2021, and it took like months, and then only on the day when Frances Haugen's the election integrity team at Facebook fell apart did she reach out to him. And so it's very much a numbers game, and formers are oftentimes even more important than current reporters. And as I said, you like finding, like, he specifically targeted the elections integrity team at Facebook because that's the mandate he was given with at the Journal. I've had different mandates when I was with Mother Jones or the Examiner. It really depends on what your audience is interested in. But I find that reaching out to people in large numbers, very large numbers on LinkedIn, on ZoomInfo, and elsewhere. And starting off, just saying, let's just chat off the record, building trust, building rapport. It's a slow burn. It's not something that happens overnight. It definitely takes months, sometimes even years. Another third unique way that I have found of getting the information I want is trying to find a family member or close friend or somebody who you can get close to, who works within the company, who can show you their internal documents and policies. So obviously this is something it's you have to be a little sensitive, because if it's found out that they're showing documents or their companies track how documents are opened and closed, it's something you have to be very careful about to make sure they don't get fired and the company doesn't find out. But I've had some success with this. Like if it's somebody you're close enough to, they may not know all the problematic or contentious or newsworthy things happening. Most people at big companies don't even know all of the policies and procedures in place. But if you can find a way to gain that trust, as I said, it helps if there's close to you or it's a family member, and spend hours or maybe a few days just looking at those documents yourself. It can really reap benefits. And I'm sure lawyers over here can, might have a different perspective on this, but I find that, as I said, the companies themselves don't oftentimes, most people at a company don't even realize that the procedures, the policies, the rules in place, but they oftentimes have access to them. Like, with Facebook files, not just Frances Haugen and the election integrity team had access to, the information on misinformation and elections. Everybody at Facebook did. Now they've closed down the gates, but at many other companies, those gates are still open. And everybody at the company, as long as you're an employee, has access to those documents. So that's a third way. And then fourth, I find, the age-old adage of like persistence. Even if you've asked a question about like how many employees are on a team, or what is your policy on this, or how have you responded to this crisis, and they don't respond, follow back up in a few weeks or follow back in a month. Maybe like change your question a little bit and contextualize it to something happening then. But if we stop asking the questions, well, there'll never be an answer. There'll never be accountability. And so sometimes the same answer, if you ask it 6 months later, 8 months later, there might be somebody different in place, or, they just might be more amenable. They might feel a need to have greater transparency. So asking those questions, even if it's similar questions again and again, I think is really important. And last but not least, try to meet people in person whenever you can. Jeff at the Wall Street Journal, I keep going back to that example, went to, he like met with Frances in the forest for like a couple of hours so that they could like build trust with each other. And like, that's important. And getting people's cell phone numbers and texting them, on their personal cells or on Signal. I find that cell phones, it's a very different form of communication and closeness you have when you're texting with somebody than over email. And then last but not least, I almost forgot one that Ken Vogel at the Times taught me, which is that pit competitors against each other. So I have found that, like, I broke a big story on Getter, which is, this conservative, freedom-focused social media platform. Jason Miller started, Trump's former top lieutenant. And, a bunch of people at Getter were leaving because they were having huge cybersecurity issues. The website was failing. People's privacy was being infringed. And they started to go to Parler and Truth Social. And those people started to come to me because, they had left there, they'd been badly treated. And on the other hand, I've had like people at Facebook tell me things about TikTok and their connections to China and privacy issues. And so if you can, go to people at Mastodon for things at Twitter. And so I oftentimes find if you go to a company's competitor, they are tracking them like a hawk, like nobody's business. And they will have a far better idea of what's happening than almost anybody else. And they may not be a whistleblower for their own company, but they have an incentive and motive to tell you about their nearest competitors. And so that's been another area that I've found fruitful.
Martha, do you want to talk about that too?
Yeah, this is, and by the way, this is so ripe with big tech companies, the idea of competitors. And also, they may have complained to the government about the behavior of the small ones have complained about the bigger ones. So you can get a lot of information, even possibly on what the government is investigating from the smaller companies who have complained to the government. So that's great. But the FTC, this is interesting. The key thing to know about privacy and trying to regulate privacy, and especially with big tech, is that the European regulators are miles ahead of where we are here. And this is just a huge debate in this country, obviously. And there are some states like California that have an advanced data privacy protection law. But there is no national data privacy legislation has emerged. It came very close last, I guess it was in the spring or summer in the House, and it came closer than it ever has been. But you can imagine the various stakeholders involved and all the complexities of getting getting legislation like that at the same time that Congress was grappling with antitrust competition legislation on big tech, and of course that hasn't made it out. And with the Republican-controlled House next year, it's probably unlikely. So the FTC, so what you're kind of left with is the FTC, and here is an agency of only 1,200 employees, and they are also very much, their portfolio, other portfolios are very much competition, antitrust, mergers, surveilling potential mergers, and also regular garden variety consumer protection on the other. And then here's data privacy right in the middle that they're dealing with also. They sort of burst onto the scene in this way in 2019 when big tech's honeymoon with Washington was over, right? 2019. Change of fortune there. And so there were two really big cases that were unprecedented. The FTC fined Facebook $5 billion for privacy violations. That was really, something of that size was unheard of, and especially for the FTC. Of course, they didn't directly sanction Mark Zuckerberg or any of the other top officials, but there was that, and also that year, YouTube, $170 million fine for violating specifically COPPA, the law regulating privacy for kids. Okay, so there's the FTC. Now comes the Biden administration. They have President Biden appointed a very, very aggressive, very young FTC chair, Alina Kahn. She's really very outstanding. She's a huge, she came up in academia with this groundbreaking analysis of Amazon and critique of Amazon. So she's coming in with a very different outlook. And I have to say, I have to actually give the FTC a little credit since this administration has been in terms of they've been less opaque. They actually started opening their meetings. Can you imagine they didn't even have open meetings before? That sort of every 3 months or so, so I guess that raises the issue of how do you find out stuff on what the FTC is doing or looking at? There was also importantly, the study that they started looking at actually drafting rules on commercial surveillance, that's a really big deal. That came last summer, an initiative, and also they sued a data broker named Kochava, and that was very groundbreaking. That was a very groundbreaking move. Kochava provides clients with advertising IDs that can be used to find where a mobile device user lives, which is a violation of FTC rules. So they're not only going after big tech here, branching out into the data broker field, which is really new and in terms of scrutiny. Okay, so it's interesting. You can find out what the FTC is doing or what people want them to do by talking to people on the Hill who are active. in this area, especially have been pushing on data privacy for a long time, are people like Richard Blumenthal, Edward Markey. You do have this sort of strange bedfellows coalition around privacy between people like that and conservative Republicans, Marsha Blackburn. The Frances Haugen situation really galvanized people to a great extent. So, but then you can find out, because it's a regulatory agency and you've got 3 Democrats now and 2 Republicans on the commission, you can try to triangulate that a little bit, get to know the staff people, the commissioners, and you also have, there's a whole galaxy of former FTC officials who are now either, a lot of them are practicing law. They're in a revolving door situation in terms of what they're dealing with. And there's also, some of them are in academia, but they do, as with any agency, they keep in touch with their old pals there. So you can often, that's a good way of finding out what's going on, whom the FTC might be investigating. It's sort of the classic approach to a regulatory agency, which obviously they're not usually very, very forthcoming. And do I have time to point out this tracked series that the AP is doing? Okay, I just wanted to mention that because, I mean, in terms of getting information from opaque and powerful institutions in this case, companies in this case, the tracked series that the AP has been, it's an ongoing investigative series supported by the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. And the latest installment was about an obscure cell phone tracking tool called Fog Reveal that gives law enforcement, at times without search warrants, the power to follow people's movements back in time, actually. So what they did was they got thousands of pages of documents and emails about this company. The company itself is called Fog Data Science, and it was put together by people who had worked in the Department of Homeland Security in the George W. Bush administration. So through FOIA requests, they were able to get thousands of pages of documents. I think that's a good example of what getting information from opaque and powerful institutions.
Thank you, Marcy. We're going to go to Ryan next, but I realized that in introducing him, I forgot to mention that the reason he came on my radar was he wrote this article for National Law Review last month that specifically focused on how Amazon and other big tech companies are branching out more into kind of the health space, however you might define that. And so anyway, he had some interesting thoughts there, and I'm going to hand it over to you now, Ryan.
Yeah, no, and really glad to be on this panel with both of you. So yes, I'm Ryan Blaney. I'm a partner at Proskauer Rose, and I head up their privacy and cybersecurity group. I'm obviously coming at it from a lot different perspective than each of you sitting up here, and so trying to think how I can be helpful. A little bit about kind of my background and kind of how I've gotten into kind of the healthcare space. Started out as a general litigator, representing mostly pharmaceutical companies, and mostly in false claims act cases, or what's called whistleblower cases. That's where someone oftentimes I was in the healthcare space, so in a pharmaceutical company, says that, the pharmaceutical company is maybe marketing a drug off-label. And there were a number of cases that started there. And what happens is an insider typically would go to the DOJ and would say, the company is violating an FDA regulation or violating something. And it allows that whistleblower to be able to collect a percentage of whatever the government eventually collects. And so it's, a very lucrative space for a whistleblower that is able to kind of be one of those whistleblowers. And so in that capacity, I was, at a law firm typically, and I was representing typically the pharmaceutical company. And usually what would happen is, the law firm and the pharmaceutical company would get alerted to this first, either through what's called like a CID or like basically just the government issuing a type of subpoena, essentially, a request for documents. And you then have to figure out, okay, what is the government concerned about? Like what's going on here? Do we have a whistleblower that's, a current, a former employee of the company? And then trying to kind of come at it similar to how you guys do on the outside, but come at it from the inside as to what's going on here and what does the government know? What documents have been shared with the government through the employee or former employer, and then coming up with a plan of how we can collect more information, who we can interview within the company, what documents we need to look at within the company to have us, be able to defend the company and to be able to, produce documents, be able to potentially put witnesses up so that the government can interview those witnesses. So that was kind of my background. And what has been interesting is now I'm still in healthcare, but I have kind of moved a lot of my practice towards kind of the healthcare privacy and healthcare cybersecurity. And, you now see, obviously you referenced it before, like kind of the alphabet soup of privacy laws, and also cybersecurity. And so it's, those two kind of terms often kind of converge, especially here in the US. And you see kind of this challenge of regulators also trying to position themselves to be the lead regulator here in the United States. So certainly the FTC has done that here in the US. But what I've also seen is state attorney generals have kind of stepped in especially when federal regulators haven't been as aggressive or proactive in some of these investigations. And they've stepped in and either 1, 2, 3, 4 states have started investigations, or they've combined and formed what's called multi-state investigations on some hot, key issues. And those issues often are the result of an investigative journalist like yourselves who write a report, publish it, and then pressure, the AGs or the federal regulators to then start an investigation. And so a lot of the work that I do is actually kind of responding to, when state AGs or a federal regulator like the FTC, starts responding to a report that you guys put out, and so it's definitely a, interesting area. What's challenging is that, the laws are evolving, and, compliance that companies are doing within the company are evolving and changing, and as new laws pass, there's not necessarily clarity around it. So the practices within a company are, changing constantly and being updated, and, what might have been permitted, a year or 2 years ago, especially in California, for example, now there are more rights. Starting January 1, for example, there's going to be more rights for employees in California, because there used to be, under the California law, which was called the CCPA, an exclusion for employees to have right to their privacy, to write for an accounting of what the company has, or what what the company has disclosed in terms of their personal information to third parties. That was excluded. And that sunset, that exclusion is going away January 1. And so, there's a lot of possibility that employees will start making requests for their own personal information. What do you, company, have on me? What personal information have you shared with third parties in the employment context about me? And so there's more rights. The point being, there's more rights that are being created in the United States, and we are certainly trying to catch up to Europe, but Europe is way, way in advance. The other thing I would just flag, because I think I've written a little bit about this and actually spoken to a couple of journalists about it. The other thing that I would flag is the Department of Justice has been obviously looking at cybersecurity, and kind of to connect my opening statement, which was I was working on False Claims Act cases in the healthcare context. The Department of Justice has now a team that is looking at using the False Claims Act statute, which allows for, as I said, whistleblower rights in the context of cybersecurity. And so the first settlement that happened was actually a healthcare company that was doing work with the VA, and they made certain representations about their cybersecurity practices that ultimately a whistleblower said, went to the government and said they in fact were not meeting those cybersecurity practices. And that company had to represent to the VA that they were complying with these cybersecurity practices in order to get that government contract, which then taxpayers are paid, to that company. Ultimately, they weren't meeting those requirements, and a whistleblower went to the DOJ. DOJ investigated. There was a settlement just under $1 million, was the first one. But it was interesting because it was one of the first times, or the first time, that the False Claims Act case was used, False Claims Act statute was used to enforce essentially a cybersecurity failure of compliance. It wasn't a breach, this was a failure of compliance. And so, if you kind of compare that to how like healthcare has been impacted, pharmaceutical, by the False Claims Act statute, and all those cases and all that billions of dollars that have been paid in civil monetary fines over the years, and money that has been paid to whistleblowers for raising their hand and saying, I think something wrong is going here. You could see that, it's not a far jump to say, okay, think of cybersecurity and the potential, failure of compliance, and the misrepresentations that companies might be making to say that they have the most robust or they have the most current cybersecurity practices in place, or they're meeting the government requirements for cybersecurity to be a government contractor, and they're not. And you could see kind of a whistleblower being incentivized to say, they're not, and I can see an opportunity to make some money here and to also do right and make sure that compliance is being done correctly. So that's something that I'm paying attention to, at least, is how that could progress and kind of used as essentially like another enforcement arm. So you have the state AGs, you have the federal government, and then you have kind of private individuals who use these statutes and use other kind of statutes to bring enforcement.
Let's open it up to questions.
I mean, this is just a really quick one to follow up on that. What's the name of the team at the Justice Department that's doing this? Or is it a specific name?
I don't know if it has a specific name. You might know if it has a specific name. I don't think it has a specific name. It's but it's the Department of Justice. It's civil, so it's civil fraud. But yeah, there's been 2 settlements. The first one was in the healthcare space. The second one was a rocket government contractor for so there were 2 settlements.
And are they looking at privacy as well, as far as you know?
So as far as I know, it's cybersecurity. That's been the focus. But obviously they kind of interplay because the compliance with privacy. So basically, it's a collection of personal information, and so you have to comply with the privacy laws that then require that you put in place certain cybersecurity safeguards when you collect that personal information. And so the two recent settlements are the failure to put in place kind of those cybersecurity safeguards in order to protect the personal information that's being collected.
I'm curious. Oh, no, go ahead, Stacey.
Oh, what was the name of the company that was sued?
So it's Comprehensive was the first one, yeah. Comprehensive Health, I believe.
Oh, no, that's fine. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about what you've seen in terms of employee monitoring. Like, what do we need to be concerned about when
Sure.
we're reaching out to internal folks?
Yeah, and so that's another area, obviously, kind of the interplay of technology and employee compliance and so forth. So there are continuously more companies, more vendors, more tools that especially larger companies are engaging with, and these technologies kind of allow for kind of the use of AI and the use of other kind of monitoring tools to be able to say, okay, Ryan Blaney is sending an email to this email account that maybe is on a list that this vendor that my company is now using has flagged as, a potential data loss, like that email is going someplace that shouldn't not be going. A company can internally monitor that. And they can, flag certain employees who have, kind of those documents going out to a location that, is not typically where they're going. They can also monitor behavior. Obviously, they can monitor behavior of visiting certain websites, and those websites could have certain implications that maybe the algorithms could flag and say, hey, we should be concerned about kind of this individual, and maybe they are more of a risk of disclosing certain information. Especially true if that individual has access to, more sensitive company-related information. So the other thing that I'm seeing from a compliance standpoint is, the fact of, a company giving access to everything, like an entire employment database and so forth, is obviously not the best practice. From a privacy standpoint, you should have more role-based access, meaning that if I'm, in marketing or whatever, that I don't need to have access to the legal files, or if I'm in legal, I don't need, the sense that, all databases should not be available to all employees within a company. That is a kind of a basic kind of compliance process that you should kind of be putting in place. But yes, there's tons of vendors out there. They're developing like crazy, and the ability for them to monitor, has always existed, but it's increasingly getting more sophisticated.
And kind of actually a direct follow-up to that.
Yeah.
Would a CCPA request to an employer reveal some of those tools, or would you only get back just your address and kind of the information you might already know?
Yeah, so there's a couple of requests so it's interesting, so the CCPA request would be the same that a consumer, because there's not a specific employment request related to that someone can make. It's just that the CCPA provides that a consumer, which was defined, broadly under the California law, can make a request for an accounting of their personal information that the company has. And so that accounting is usually broken down into categories of types of personal information. They can also make a request for an accounting of what that company shared, like what categories of personal information was shared with a third party. Certainly to the extent that it's being sold, that's a whole separate area, but assuming that an employee is not selling employment information and they're in fact just sharing, so it's an accounting. So that same right applies now starting January 1 for employment information, which before that was excluded. So presumably an employee could only request what categories of personal information have you collected about me? And then what have you shared in terms of those categories, and with whom, like with what parties? But you also have the right to correction, which I think in the employment context is going to be a big deal. And you have the right to deletion, make a request for deletion. Deletion obviously is going to be pretty challenging because, especially if they're a current employee, how are you going to be able to delete? I mean, the response is likely just going to be, sorry, we can't delete your information. We need it because you're an employee. But the correction could be interesting because you could play this out and say, maybe they have, certain personal information. Maybe they're going to try to make a request. I want a correction about kind of my review. Presumably the company's going to have in place a process that says, sorry, we don't make corrections on the substance of reviews and that kind of personnel file. We only make corrections related to whether your birthday is correct or not. But all that's going to be played out, and companies are going to have to deal with those requests, is the long and short.
Marcy, I'm wondering, so you mentioned the FTC has 1,200 employees. Do you have a sense of how many are dedicated to privacy, just so we have a sense of like how that's prioritized?
Sorry, I don't.
Okay.
I don't know. But it's not enough.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
I talked to the people at NIST a lot about cybersecurity rules, and one of the things that I think is really that I'm hearing from people, and I'm curious since y'all live here and work with the government, is privacy really, I know it's a focus in the sense like we talk a lot about it, but I really feel like the government's like privacy and cybersecurity kind of walk in together, and then the government's like, cybersecurity, come over here, and they'll talk to privacy, but privacy is never going to get like brought into the back room or being part of any laws or anything like that. So I'm just kind of curious because what y'all's take individually is on each of them.
Good. I can jump in. So, yeah, okay. So I would say that, yes, I think that's kind of a good perception of kind of historically where privacy has sat. Certainly always behind cybersecurity, although cybersecurity wasn't that advanced either. I mean, I think what the U.S. has kind of been more aggressive with, and what a lot of attention has been on, is breaches. All 50 states have data breach laws. In those data breach laws, there are always provisions that define what is considered personal information for the purposes of determining whether a breach has occurred. So privacy, often kind of has started with, okay, this is how the breach law defines personal information. So this is the category of information that we need to collect. What's interesting though is how that personal information to define is pretty darn narrow, because if you think about it, it's always looking at, if a bad actor gets access to this personal information, what can they do nefariously with that information? So, for example, it's not your credit card information. It's your financial account plus PIN, meaning that you have to have something plus. It's not simply your email address. It's your email address plus password. So there's always like a plus that kind of is what triggers the breach. What's happening now is that, if you look at California, you're creating privacy rights that protect just the fact that you have personal information, because there's a determination that there's value to that. And you can see that in that companies, are collecting it all, and that they can see the value, and they're buying other companies because they see the value in that personal information. I sit in the healthcare space. You can see companies like Amazon, like other companies that are buying medical practices. And certainly it's to do medical work and to kind of get in that space, but you can also see the value associated with all those data sets. So to answer your question, I think you're right in that it both privacy and cybersecurity really haven't been on the forefront. But I think as more kind of focus happens and more value is associated with personal information besides just the breach information, that you'll see more.
Yeah, I definitely think that, as you rightly mentioned, there is like a much higher priority placed on cybersecurity. One, because it's viewed as like a tangible tool to protect privacy, that, if you have the right procedures in place, then people's personal information will be protected. But it's also because there's just a lot more money in cybersecurity. Like, that's where the demand is. And, the government is willing to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on it. Why do we have like zero trust? We have a whole, massive government, all of government effort from the Biden administration, focus on zero trust, whereas there's no 100% privacy initiative. There's no big push for protecting everybody's privacy. And, so companies and contractors, everybody goes to like, where is the money?
And the government cares about it from the national security, right?
Yeah.
They push the national security angle of it to get the money in and everything.
Yeah, and the money, and so going back to breaches, for example, like I was just yesterday reporting on how over like 6,000 asylum seekers who've come here from mostly Central and South America, their information was put out on the ICE Immigration Customs Enforcement website on Monday accidentally. But all the solutions that they're talking about are cybersecurity related, because they're like, if we had this better process in place, it was accidental. It didn't mean to do it, but those are where, and they're like trying to claw back the information now. But I think that all the solutions for privacy, not all of them, but many of them, or most of them, are cybersecurity related. And, sort of going back to like what the future will look like, there needs to be a lot more legislation and funding for privacy related things if that is going to be the focus. Like the way you say, we like roll out the red carpet for cybersecurity companies, the government. I mean, that's because, that's what the laws and policies are in place about right now. We haven't had any massive comprehensive privacy legislation passed so far. If that happens, then it might be different. And I think, very importantly, there needs to be money associated with protecting privacy.
Yeah.
That is when there will really be a radar shift.
Money is in penalties, or just money is in like I sell software that will.
More the latter. As in, I can make money off of protecting people's privacy, and there's an incentive for me to do so. In terms of penalties, I mean, that already does occur. The FTC, does dole out, we can debate over like how big those penalties are, whether it's just the cost of business for a company like Facebook or Amazon, because many of them just will flout it because it's the fines, are arguably not that big. But that does occur. I think that's a more legal matter where it's like a little bit harder to determine when a privacy violation has occurred, has real harm. But some penalties do occur. Many argue there should be higher fines. And that could play a role.
No, I totally agree with that. That's a problem throughout the government regulators, that it really is the cost of doing business for a lot of these. Really. And again, and also, if the regulators assess penalties, but they don't actually, and they sue the company, but they don't go after the top executives. That's something that's changing a little bit, and the FTC is looking more at, right? That's a big.
Mark Zuckerberg and Sundar Pichai.
He apparently was not even deposed as part of that process of the 2019 privacy fine. He was not even, it's kind of crazy when you think about it.
So when you're looking at some of these regulatory agencies that are obviously full of lawyers that are really conscientious about what they're sharing, and how do you think through just like the incentives that people have to talk to journalists? when you're looking for information and trying to understand the inner workings of these institutions, like, how do you just think through why they would want to talk to you? And also, like, what sort of steps do you think about in how to protect their identity?
Yeah, very good question. Yeah, a lot of it has to, it's kind of a tough start. It's like running a race, but you're starting from down on the ground, and you have to really establish yourself first, sort of on that beat, and show that you have stories that are fair and that are hopefully significant. But yeah, it's again, and it goes back to gaining trust with people, as Nihal said, and you have to, almost the equivalent of, I guess that's the high-tech equivalent of cold calling, what you do, right?
Cold calling,
Right?
absolutely.
With Zoom Link, and what was the other that you?
Like LexisNexis.
Lex, there, yeah. Especially with current staff. There are a lot of lawyers, they're trying to get more data scientists as on staff, and fewer lawyers and more data people and scientific people. But it's sort of what you have to, and you have to feel out each individual situation in each individual agency. It's really, really different. It is a long haul project, and it's difficult.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of incentives, like I've found, whether it's at like the FTC or other agencies, especially in like the tech sphere, like if you can come to them with like an issue that is occurring, you have evidence from somewhere else or somebody else that a problem is occurring, I think they're much more likely to talk. If you've already brought them a little bit of bait, and then they can explain to you what's happening from their perspective on this problem. I almost, always like start off like off the record and just make it clear I'm not trying to have a gotcha moment here, and just trying to better understand what's happening. And I find that like having something already in your back pocket. Otherwise, if you're sort of just like broadly hunting, I find it's like it's harder for them to have that incentive. I obviously feel like people, if you ever hear that somebody's about to leave an agency, that is like the time to pounce. That is the time to like make sure very clearly that you are like the first person that they whisper into. It's a key moment.
Right, or even just drawing them out on an issue of concern to them. Like approaching them that way, even if you don't have information to give, but maybe you can, oh wow, they're really worried about
this. This is like a pet project that they have
exactly
like social investment in,
Yeah.
or feel like this is a problem in society.
Yeah, talk to them that way. Yeah.
The FTC, they're regulators. Why are they too concerned about talking to the press off the record or on background? I mean, I just don't understand. I guess I completely understand why companies are a pain, but I don't understand why the FTC wouldn't want why they're so trepidatious.
Well, yeah, because it's the government, and because especially when they're investigating, when it's the question of them investigating a company, and almost everything they do affects companies, and they're so sensitive about, and they're just very, they're regulators, but they're bureaucrats. They're very skittish about talking to reporters, unless it's a really big staged press conference where they've already accomplished, they want to brag about a huge fine or a huge
There's not a motivation or incentive to talk about something while it's still in process. they're still in the middle of an investigation,
yeah.
or they're deciding whether to investigate a company. They don't want the press getting ahead and writing about something that hasn't been decided, or it could make it harder for them to then investigate a company if they know that they're being investigated. Or so yeah, and so it's usually once something is already public or they're ready to make it public is their interest. Otherwise, you're sort of unearthing things that might make their lives more difficult.
That's where you're more likely to get stuff about an investigation from the rivals from the competitors of the companies. They've been talking also to the regulators, but they're happy to blab to you. I've just seen, especially with tech companies, they are so happy to stab each other in the back. It's just, it's really amazing, right? You've seen that,
Yeah,
too,
yeah,
right?
I have.
I mean,
with Twitter, with Facebook.
Oh,
with
yeah.
Amazon.
And what they say about each other off the record is just, it's amazing.
Yeah, and they're saying that like, for example, that like TikTok's data is being viewed by people in the CCP. They obviously have to have evidence behind that. You don't just take what they say. They usually will, somebody at Facebook will provide you with like some sort of a link or a document or something that shows you this is what's actually happening at TikTok, or they'll point you towards like 3 former TikTok people who you can talk to. So it's it's always, there has to be some sort of documentation or evidence, or you need to hear from like 3 to 5 people or more that this is what's actually happening and verify that they are who they say they are. So it's not just taking one person's like word for at face value about their competitor. There has to be a bunch more due diligence after that. But going back to your question before, I think another reason people in the government don't talk is because they just have such stringent gatekeepers. Like their press team and communications team just have it on lock, like never talk to anybody unless you go through me or that I'm like around and away. And that's why I like to focus on getting people's cell phones and talking to them, privately, and just making it very clear that I will never write anything unless I get your express consent, or that basically everything is off the record until we have a conversation. And that way, at least I can know about what's happening and have a channel of communication. Maybe I can confirm it with somebody else, or follow that trail. But anytime I go through press, going through a government agency's press office is almost never, unless they have something very positive to share, it's never going to lead to it's never going to lead to anything fruitful or juicy.
I'm just curious, do you run quotes? Like when I try to talk to people in government, if they do the quotes, they're like, send it to me before you print. I'm like, I don't do that. They're like, then no quote.
Generally speaking, unless I've already agreed to do that with the source, in the post, I'm not going to suddenly show you the quotes. It's like if for some reason it's a senior person and they've said, okay, please show me the quotes before
you agree to do that?
I guess like once in a while, like I will say you can see the quotes just in terms of like accuracy. Sometimes I record things or sometimes I don't. They're like, okay, for accuracy purposes, I'll show you. But like I almost never will say, okay, you can change the quote. That will not happen. I will just say, okay, just for you, so you have an awareness in case I got some number wrong or I got somebody's name wrong. Okay, you can see it just for accuracy, but I'm not going to change my quote because now you've decided that. So, but yeah, so it's all like dependent on, the agreement that you have right in the beginning. And that's, sometimes if you really want to talk to somebody, you'll just say, okay, it'll be off the record. And then maybe we'll agree on something on background or on the record afterwards. So it just depends on how much you want to talk to them and how comfortable they are.
Hi. So obviously there's like staff directories or conferences for meeting people on these issues and networking with them. But I'm curious if there are other resources or venues that you have found particularly helpful in building that network of sources at companies or the FTC, for example, to get those, those inside scoops on privacy issues.
Oh, that's conferences. That's a great idea. Yeah. And that's, again, where you can pick up on an issue like, oh, this official is really, he's really interested and concerned about this. Maybe I can talk to him off the record sometime and we can get something going. Of course, you go up to people and you give them your card or whatever at a conference, but they might not want to make it so visible. They might not want to make it so public. You'd have to contact them outside. But that's an excellent venue. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like online, yeah, obviously, I think like in person is it's a great way to just nab somebody there. But online is where I found it to be far more fruitful. And so, LinkedIn, for example, has a feature where you can find former employees of a company, or sometimes, obviously, you can find like current employees, and there's like, there will be like 15, 20 pages or 100 pages for like a particular company. So I find LinkedIn to be a good way. You have to use like the advanced search functions within LinkedIn. I've started using ZoomInfo. I don't know if you guys are aware if it's like an online database. ZoomInfo and Rocket Search. Rocket Search is free. I think you get like 10 searchers a month, and then ZoomInfo, I don't know, like we have a paid subscription. But you can basically look up any person and it shows you their email address and contact information. So if you have a staff directory or some other database, you can plug that into ZoomInfo or Rocket Search and find their contact info. You can also like search for employees within a company within Zoom, and you can target within that company. Sometimes you can even target within the teams that they have. And then reach out to them on email or on via text. And so, yeah, I mean, there's only so many conferences you can go to, and I find that, yeah, reaching out to people online is certainly going to be effective, and just being like disarming and being just, yeah, friendly and, open to talking off the record. And,
the other thing I would add too is like, to the extent that there is a big press release where, that particular regulator, whether it's the state AG or the FTC, has come out and said, hey, we had a big settlement with this company for these privacy violations, oftentimes there'll be people that get credit towards the end of that press release. And you can certainly kind of track them, because those are typically the same team that is going to work on the next one, or is currently working on the next investigation, because typically within the government, like kind of they work in teams, and there'll be some variations to it with turnover and so forth. But that's also a good way to see, okay, and certainly I do that from my perspective when I get a CID, like a company I'm representing or client I'm representing gets a CID, and I see, which entity and which like person is the investigator on that CID, and because then I'll go and look, okay, what types of cases did that individual work on in the past, and have settlements to get a sense for kind of what they might be thinking about and looking in and focused on.
Just to build on that a little bit, like whether you're meeting someone at a conference or just over the internet, and whether you're working on a specific story or just want to kind of build your source network, like could you just share a little bit about like your opening line, like how you don't like scare people off by being like, I'm a reporter and I want to talk to you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I oftentimes like to lead with, so for example, in the government, like if I'm talking to folks on the Hill or within an agency, I will sometimes like highlight the fact that, like, if I'm talking to Democrats, I'll talk about the fact that I've like worked at Mother Jones, and maybe like highlight a story that I feel like might be like friendly to them. Whereas if I'm talking to Republicans, I might highlight that I worked at the Examiner and maybe a particular story I worked there. But it's I just usually like to find, if you have the time at least, an issue. Like, I always like to come in with an idea for something I'm already looking into. I don't like to just say vaguely like, oh, hey, it would be great to chat. I find that it's just, I mean, some people will still talk to you. I mean, especially, I don't know, if you're at like the Times or the Post or somewhere, they might just talk to you. But I find that if there's something specific you're looking into, and to give them a sense of, okay, this is something that's important to me, and that I'm looking into, and just sort of like grab their attention in some way to see, okay, like this person has something important or something that could like rock the boat, and I might be able to like play a role there. And then, you know, I think just, you know, I usually, you know, at the end, you know, say very clearly, you know, I usually just try to ask for like 5 or 10 minutes of somebody's time, just like a very small ask, just 5 to 10 minutes, you know, we can like just talk off the record. Yeah, and then I think, you know, the other two important things are to like follow up. Oftentimes, like somebody won't get back to me until I've reached out to them like 5 or 7 times. Finally, the guilt like builds up and builds up, and like it pops in. It's like, oh God, like this guy has been like after me, and like, okay, let's like throw him a little bone here. So it's that. Yeah, but just like continuing to be like polite. And I think the other thing that I find helpful is that I have like a newsletter, or like I have like a text chain where I send out like key stories of mine to like sources. And so if they realize through that, you know, emails or text that, oh, you're writing about this subject again and again, then they're more likely to be like, oh, okay, like this is what they're interested in. They're serious about it. Okay, you know, let me go to them. So even if they're not talking to you, sometimes I'll just like send them my story, because it just sort of like shows them that, okay, you're not talking to me, but other people are talking to me, and you know, maybe you might have a voice that, you know, that you wanna get in there. But yeah, regardless of how many times, you sort of just always have to try to be like polite and nice, and act as if you're talking to them for the first time, even if you've tried a bunch of times before.
So how do you get their cell phone though? Like, how do you go that next step? Like
that's usually in person,
because that's obviously much more personal, which is the point of it. Yeah,
I mean, usually like I'll just try to like ask them, like if it's email if it's email, just like ask them like what's the best number to reach you on, and then once I'm on the call, like if they give me their office cell phone, office number, office cell, at the end of the call I'll say like what's the best number to keep in touch on, and like it would be great to like have your personal cell. So once I'm on the phone with them in any way, shape, or form, at the end of it, I try to get their personal cell phone number. It's hard in your initial interaction, like, oh, by the way, please give me your personal. I don't recommend that. Get to know them a little bit before doing so. Or like in a personal interaction, like I'll chat with them for 5 or 10 minutes, and then at the end of it, I'll get their card and then say, oh, can I like also take down your cell, or like what's the best way to like talk on Signal? So,
just quick follow-up to that though. So have you ever had the experience of like finding someone's contact information through Zoom info and like cold calling them, and just them getting mad that you've dug up their contact, or like losing a source like that or anything?
Oh yeah. I've had people get mad for sure. Usually I just say like, oh, like a colleague gave it to me. Or, you know, I won't go in and, you know, talk about, oh, like I stalked you half an hour and found your details. But yeah, I mean, sometimes people ask, and, you know, I mean, they know this is my job to do it after all. And yeah, I mean, sometimes people will get angry. I mean, that's I guess just like par for the course. And I, you know, try not to take it personally. And, you know, I guess I would just immediately say, you know, like, I'm just trying to understand this issue better. I want to talk to you. I'm not trying to like get you into trouble. If you don't want to be on the record, that's fine. Like, we won't, you know, we don't have to talk in that capacity. So I just try to put them at ease, and then say, like, you know, look at my previous track record. Look at the stories I've written. Like, I don't screw people over. I'm here for the long run. And so, but yeah, people being surprised that I got their contact info, does happen. I don't know, maybe like 10-20% of the time. But they also know, that this is what I do.
And you mentioned the Hill. The Hill is so much easier than the agencies, isn't it?
Yeah,
the Hill
people
is...
on the Hill talks.
Man,
it's
it is
more,
just.
And there's much less media training. There's fewer gatekeepers. And there's just more of a political sort of muscle there. But yeah, I mean, being afraid of talking to people yeah, I mean, it's like an occupational hazard. If that's the case, then in person or online, it's going to be a little difficult to break news.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for going over time a little bit. I appreciate you staying, and let's give them a hand.